r/nosleep. Posted by you/TroncdeNadal. I worked at a daycare that's been abandoned since 2001. Part 1. I pulled my thick woolen scarf up to my nose so it covered my entire face except my eyes. I couldn't stand the stinging wind hitting my skin any longer. You may be wondering what reasons drove a 17-year-old girl like me to spend that chilling December morning roaming the empty streets of my town instead of being at home curled up in a cozy blanket enjoying my favorite TV show alongside a cup of hot chocolate. Well, it wasn't exactly my choice. Alright, Cindy. I understand it's the holidays and you want to relax, but I don't want you to be glued to the couch and the internet all day, and besides, you're only a few months away from becoming a legal adult and it's time for you to learn to handle responsibilities. That's why I've gotten in contact with a nearby daycare center and have applied you for a part-time job. You'll be taking care of children ages 3 to 6 starting next Monday up until the end of the holidays every morning excluding weekends. My mother suddenly announced to me the day after the holidays began. And so, there I was, on my way to the daycare center I'd be working at for the duration of the holidays because my mother had said so, delivering the news without warning a mere 2 days before my job was supposed to begin and stubbornly refusing a no for an answer. What she forgot to tell me was that in order to get to the daycare I had to spend 20 minutes walking under a snowfall that made my teeth chatter and erase the ability to feel anything on my hands and feet, even though I was wearing gloves and boots that were supposedly made to protect me from that kind of weather. It was so cold it almost felt like they weren't there. My mother could only come to pick me up by car after my shift because she had to go to work in the morning. The thought of having to repeat that grueling process on a daily basis made me wish I'd just freeze on the spot on day one and forget about it. After somehow managing to survive the initial trek without turning into a human popsicle, I reached my destination in a neighborhood on the other side of town, or at least I did according to the directions my mother had given me. I was standing in front of a rundown, old-looking building unsuspectingly tucked in between 2 apartment blocks and a back alley. This was supposed to be the daycare I was going to work at, but it had no signs or any indication whatsoever that conveyed its purpose. In fact, when I approached its windows and peeked inside, it seemed to be completely empty. I phoned my mother and asked her if the address she had given me was correct. Indeed, she assured it was the one she had been provided with by whoever she had reached out to when she applied me for the job. I felt scammed, powerless and outraged, not at my mother, since I understood that mistake wasn't her fault, but at the ones that had shared that address with her. Were the managers of that daycare so utterly incompetent as to provide new employees with the wrong directions and accidentally lead them to a random derelict warehouse? Had I wasted an entire morning exposing myself to a blizzard for nothing? I didn't know the answers to those questions yet, but I knew I was freezing and lost in a neighborhood I had only ever been to once or twice in my entire life, so I decided to find the nearest place I could rest and warm myself up in, which turned out to be a cafe around the corner which also served as a bed and breakfast for those in urgent need of a place to sleep at for a cheap price. So, what's a youngster like you doing around here with this frigid weather raging outside? I thought I wasn't going to have any customers today, especially not this early in the morning. Asked the barista as I slurped on the delicious cappuccino I had ordered. I was the only one present in that cafe aside from him, so he was probably looking forward to engage in small talk with me to combat boredom. I applied for a job at a daycare center that's supposed to be around here, but I was given the wrong address and I can't find it. Is there any chance you happen to know about it? I replied. A daycare? I'm sorry girl, but whoever's given you this address needs to work on their sense of orientation because there's no daycare in this neighborhood as far as I know, not anymore. There used to be one many years ago, but it closed around the early 2000s if I'm not mistaken. Apparently there was some kind of shady accident involving a kid and some of the staff, but don't quote me on that. I've only heard rumors that probably exaggerated things for the sake of drama. I wasn't even working in this neighborhood yet when it all happened. The building's still standing in that back alley right around the corner, but it's been abandoned for 2 decades. I doubt you'll be able to find anything helpful in there. The barista explained. Hearing the barista's words was like having been woken up by a water bucket in the face, like a revelation that flipped my attitude towards my current situation on its head, from outrage and resentment to curiosity and intrigue. I was positive the abandoned daycare the barista spoke about in the rundown building I had been led to were one and the same. Now I was sure this whole thing had to be much more than a simple mistake or coincidence. Did the people that had sent me there know about the abandoned daycare? Did they know there was a daycare in the neighborhood but not that it was abandoned? But that made no sense. If the daycare was no longer operational then I couldn't have been hired for the job because it meant the business responsible for hiring me simply did not exist anymore. I needed to get to the bottom of this, and thus, driven by a newfound motivation, I once again headed to that mysterious building in that back alley, the so-called abandoned daycare, climbed up its windows and broke inside, convinced it would lead me to new discoveries that would allow me to piece together the mess I had unwillingly gotten myself into. Plus, my mother was still at work, so if I wanted to return home, I had to go there by foot, and there was no way that was going to happen. The inside of the building was equally as derelict and gloomy as the outside. Its walls were faded and moldy and there were spider webs in nearly every corner. I covered my face with my scarf once more, but this time it wasn't due to the cold, but because of the possible presence of asbestos. The building's layout consisted of various large chambers that were most likely playrooms where the children that once attended the daycare used to play in, judging by the amount of old toys scattered all over the place. Something was off about those toys though. They looked withered and broken, but not in the way you'd expect from toys that have been sitting untouched for 20 years. They looked as if someone had damaged them on purpose. But who could have done such a thing? The children that attended the daycare back in the day? I found it rather unlikely that the daycare's staff would just let them destroy all the toys and leave them there for no apparent reason. One of the playrooms led to a small enclosed backyard filled with kiddie attractions such as a slide, a seesaw and a pair of swings. They looked to be in terrible condition, however, overgrown with tall grass. It was kind of melancholic, a place that had most likely brought joy to many young boys and girls now reduced to a depressing empty shell of its former self. It was a shame, because sure, the building was run down, but it looked like it could easily be restored and repurposed after a cleanup. It made me wonder even more about the cause of its closure and the mysterious accident the barista had told me about. I spotted a wall filled with various old drawings most likely made by the children who used to frequent the place. The pieces of paper they had been drawn on had grown moldy and acquired a yellowish tone not unlike the wall they hung on. Other than that, they seemed to be rather ordinary drawings, until I spotted a certain one that made me pause for a few seconds to double-check if what I was seeing was truly real. It was a drawing depicting a pair of teenage girls. I didn't recognize one of the girls, who was blonde with pale Caucasian skin tone, but the other one was wearing a coat, a bobble hat, a woolen scarf, a pair of gloves and a pair of boots identical to the clothes I was wearing at that exact moment. Her skin tone, hair and eye colors were also the same as mine, and to top it all off, the detail that made my skin go pale was a name written right below the two girls in capital letters, Cindy and. It was apparent the drawing was missing a chunk of paper where the name of the unknown other girl would have been written alongside mine. Who's there? I uttered nervously as I heard what sounded like a high-pitched laughter as I was still trying to process the drawing I had found. I got no answer. Seconds later, I shrieked in panic as I felt what I can only describe as an invisible figure running right past me. I didn't see or hear it, but I swear I felt something moving mere inches away from my body. I decided I had already seen enough and headed straight to the window I had entered the building from, only to find it was somehow locked, despite the fact I was sure I had left it open when I first entered the place. Die, sin. What sounded like distorted, barely intelligible moans could be heard in the distance. For a second I almost thought I had heard someone uttering or rather struggling to utter something that sounded very similar to my name. The sight I was met with upon turning to look at whoever had muttered those ominous murmurs left me paralyzed in terror. A couple of shadowy figures were standing at the other end of the hallway that branched out into the various playrooms. One looked to be around the same height as me, while the other was the size of a preschooler. Both of their skin looked horribly burned and melted, as if it were made of wax and were falling apart, but could never quite finish the process. Aside from a few thin locks of hair loosely dangling from their heads, they were practically bald and their demarcated faces were almost featureless aside from a couple of small hollow holes I assumed were their eyes, or at least what remained of them. I was so utterly terrified I couldn't move or scream or cry or do anything besides standing still and staring at them as I trembled in fear. My body and mind were in so much stress I genuinely thought I was going to pass out at any moment. To this day, I still have no idea how I managed to maintain my composure. I snapped out of my shock once the two figures started moving towards me. Their advance was slow and agonizing. They seemed to be in pain every time they took a step forward as they repeated the same moans I had heard earlier. I released all the tension screaming to the top of my lungs and running away in hopes of finding a hiding spot. I rushed up a staircase that led to the daycare's upper floor which I hadn't explored yet. It was much smaller than the ground floor, only consisting of a disgusting bathroom that smelled just as you'd imagine a bathroom that hasn't been cleaned in 20 years to smell, and what looked to be a dining room with a kitchen directly adjacent to it. The dining room was filled with tables and chairs scattered across the floor alongside a broken CRT television and a bunch of old VHS tapes containing several cartoons and kids shows aimed towards a preschooler audience. I hid in the kitchen where various empty shelves and closets could be found, alongside a cockroach or two. I squeezed myself inside a small closet and hoped for the best. After a few seconds of silence, I heard the two entities roaming the dining room despite the fact I hadn't heard them climb the stairs which they needed to have climbed in order to get there. They approached the kitchen as I sat in the closet trying not to move a muscle or emit any sound. It seemed they were getting closer, closer to my hiding spot, as if they knew I was there all along. Sin, die. Both of them uttered. This time I was sure I had heard them pronounce my name. Despite all my efforts to hold the closet door shut, it swung open as tears started running down my face. The two figures stood in front of me, aggressively lunging themselves towards me and grabbing my arms and legs. I felt a wave of stinging pain across my whole body the second I came into physical contact with them, as if I was being electrocuted. It was unbearably painful, but it only lasted an instant, as I faded into unconsciousness immediately afterwards. I woke up inside the same closet I had been caught in. The relief I felt upon confirming I was still alive and in one piece was followed by intrigue as I realized the two entities were nowhere to be found. My confusion would only increase from there, as it didn't take long before I discovered both the kitchen and the dining room didn't look like how they used to before I had fainted, at all. I didn't know how long had I been unconscious for, but the previously dirty and run-down chamber was suddenly in pristine condition. Everything was clean without any cockroaches or spider webs to speak of. The chairs and tables were no longer broken and on the floor, but had been meticulously arranged as if someone was supposed to eat there soon. The television and the VHS tapes as well, even the lights were suddenly working now. Was this some sort of dream? For a moment, I wondered if I had been put in a coma because I couldn't find any logical explanation. I pinched myself to check if I was awake or not, and I felt the pinch, meaning this was happening for real. I descended the staircase utterly baffled, only to find the ground floor also suddenly looked like it had been inexplicably refurbished in an instant. The walls were now painted with bright colors and adorned with posters, stickers and murals. The previously broken toys in the playrooms were now neatly placed in shelves and almost looked as if they had just arrived straight from the assembly line. To say my mind was blown would be a severe understatement. What the hell was going on? Upon hearing a collection of high-pitched voices coming from the playrooms, my heart rate started to rise once again as I thought the two entities had reappeared, and if that had been the case, I probably wouldn't have been as shocked as I was when I found out the sources of those voices were children, regular children, just a bunch of little boys and girls having fun in several different ways. There seemed to be nothing paranormal about them in the slightest. Some were playing indoors with toys and with each other, others tinkered with arts and crafts and others played in the backyard, which just like the rest of the building, had inexplicably been ridden of all traces of decay and was now a beautiful sight that almost invited you to go outside and go wild. It was cold and there was snow, but the children playing in the backyard were well bundled up and weren't letting the low temperatures ruin their fun. Some children began to silently stare at me believing I didn't notice and would turn their backs and giggle playfully once they realized I knew they were watching. "Hey, you! What do you think you're doing here? How did you get in? Don't you know this is a daycare for little kids? You'd better explain yourself now or else you'll have to explain yourself to the cops," yelled a young woman carrying an old-school flip phone identical to those that were all the rage back in the 2000s. I'm sorry ma'am. The place looked empty when I first arrived so I decided to enter through a window and then, things happened and, anyway, that's not the point. The thing is, my name's Cindy and I've come here because I've applied for a job. I'm supposed to help in taking care of the children. I nervously replied, improvising a response for a question I was not prepared for. "Oh, now that you mention it, I do remember being told about a new employee that would be joining us soon. Please forgive me for my reaction. My name's Rebecca, pleased to meet you. I didn't expect you to come today. They didn't tell me the exact date of your arrival. It's probably a mistake on someone's part. Anyhow, welcome to our humble daycare. You can take your winter gear off. This building is equipped with a heating system to keep everyone warm and cozy," Rebecca explained. "Thank you, Rebecca, but I think I'll leave my winter clothes on, because you're right, this has been a mistake. So how about we call it a day and we'll see about tomorrow, okay?" I answered before starting to walk at a fast pace, making a beeline towards the front door and exiting that building at long last. I tried calling my mother on the phone to ask her to come there and take me back home with her car, but it was no use. Every time I tried I just received a voicemail telling me the number I was calling did not exist. Not knowing what to do, I decided to head back to the cafe from earlier. "Hi, what can I do for you?" asked the barista, except that wasn't the same person I had met earlier. The middle-aged man was nowhere to be seen, and in his place was a woman who looked to be around the same age as Rebecca. "Hello, I've just come here to rest for a bit, it's been a really intense morning," I replied. Sure, make yourself at home. By the way, is everything alright?" she asked upon noticing my concerned looks. "It's nothing, it's just that I wasn't expecting to find you in here. I visited this establishment a couple hours ago and there was a different barista. He must be a coworker of yours, right?" I explained. "What are you talking about? I'm the only barista working here. I've spent the entire morning in this cafe and haven't seen you before. Are you sure the cafe you visited a couple hours ago wasn't a different one?" the barista answered in confusion. "Yes, I was absolutely certain it was the exact same cafe. First the daycare and now this. Seriously, it was as if the universe had decided that morning was the ideal time to make me go insane." But before I had time to question my sanity, I spotted a calendar right beside the cafe's counter that left me speechless. The date displayed on it was December 2001. I worked at a daycare that's been abandoned since 2001. Part 2. I spent the night at the cafe, as it was also a budget bed and breakfast, which I believe I already mentioned last time. The room I slept in was nothing special, but it was perfectly functional, with a decent bed, a small bathroom, a drawer and a closet to store the few belongings I had, and even a CRT television, which looked pretty dated by modern standards. But remember that the only reason I was staying at the cafe in the first place was because I had somehow traveled back in time after my terrifying paranormal misadventure at the daycare. That morning, before having breakfast, I turned on the CRT TV and watched the news to make sure I had truly time traveled. Indeed, the news that were broadcasted were clearly from December of 2001, and they were live broadcasts, so yeah, as much as my poor brain struggled to comprehend it, this was happening for real. I needed to get to the bottom of this, and the only place where I'd be able to find a way to solve and get out of this mess was the same place where I had gotten myself into that mess, the daycare. So after bundling up, I made my way towards that dreaded building. When I went to the daycare for the first time, the weather was unbearably cold. In fact, that was precisely one of my main complaints against having to go there by foot, and the weather of 2001 was equally as frigid. But since the cafe and the daycare were only a 5-minute walk away from each other, so the cold didn't bother me nearly as much this time. Upon reaching the back alley where the daycare was located, I heard what sounded like footsteps right behind me, as if I was being followed. I turned around to find a teenage girl right behind me, who looked to be around the same age and height as me, but I couldn't get a good grasp of her overall appearance because she was heavily covered in winter clothing just like me. Hello, are you following me?" I asked. "What? No, I'm heading to a daycare center located right in this alleyway," she replied. "Wait, really? I'm going there too. Why are you going there, if I may ask?" I answered in astonishment. "I've been hired to work there part-time and helping to take care of the children. It's actually my first day," she explained. "No way. I've been hired for the same job. Technically, my first day was yesterday, but things didn't go as expected and that's why I'm coming back today. The name's Cindy, by the way," I said, even more shocked than I already was. I could have warned her about the dangers of the daycare, and I very nearly did just that, but a last-second decision made me change my mind, as I figured the possibility of her believing me was so minuscule it wasn't worth it to try, at least not at that moment. I didn't want to come off as a delusional weirdo on my first impression. "I'm Molly, nice to meet you. I didn't expect to have a co-worker, but hey, I think I'm gonna like it," she joyfully introduced herself. Molly and I finally arrived at the daycare. Once we took off our winter gear, I got a better chance to appreciate Molly's appearance. She had the same tall and slim complexion as myself, but her blonde straight hair and pale Caucasian skin contrasted with my brownish skin and dark curls. We were soon greeted by Rebecca, the woman who was in charge of taking care of the kids who I had already met the previous day. The daycare was in the same state as when I had last seen it, a far cry from the derelict abandoned building it had become in my time. "Well, look who it is. Your name was Cindy, am I right? Forgive me, but you left so abruptly yesterday I thought you were never going to come back. Who's the girl you've brought with you?" Rebecca said to me. "She's called Molly and she's also come to work here," I answered. "Seriously? Nobody tells me anything these days. Then again, I'm not the one who writes the paychecks, so I guess it's none of my business. In any case, welcome to the daycare, both of you. You can start your shift right now," Rebecca replied. And thus, Molly and I spent that morning working at the daycare normally, just having a good time playing with the children, doing some arts and crafts and occasionally intervening in a minor dispute between preschoolers, but honestly those were the exception as the kids that attended the daycare were surprisingly well behaved. It got to a point I was enjoying working there so much I almost forgot about the fact I had time traveled and about how much of a horrible experience the previous day had been, with the abandoned daycare and the pair of phantoms that had hunted me down and then somehow sent me back in time. Molly and I decided to organize a little art contest where we would encourage the kids to draw something cute and then we judge their work and declare a winner. Even though we actually planned to declare everyone the winner because we didn't want to discourage anyone. "Aw, Cindy, look. Aren't we adorable?" Molly said as she showed me a drawing a child had made depicting Molly and I with the names Cindy and Molly written below. But I didn't pay attention to it, as I was too busy focusing on a drawing a little boy named Hugh had made. He had drawn a pair of familiar figures, pale and decrepit with barely recognizable facial features, one of them being considerably taller than the other. I had no doubt about it, they were the entities I had encountered the previous day. "Hugh, why have you chosen to draw these creatures?" I nervously asked as horrifying memories of the previous day came flooding back. "Because I saw them earlier in the backyard. They were watching me," the boy casually replied as I felt shivers down my spine. I immediately rushed to the daycare's backyard, but saw no one. "Hey, Cindy. What's the matter? Where are you going?" Molly asked in confusion. It's nothing, Molly. Don't worry," I replied, letting out a forced smile. The time for the children to go home arrived as I was still swept in paranoia. That horrible feeling only increased once we found out Hugh was missing. Rebecca instructed Molly and I to search for him as her and the other kids left the building, leaving us on our own. "Cindy, don't try to hide it, something concerns you. You've been acting weird ever since Hugh showed you that creepy drawing he made," Molly said. "I'll explain it to you later, now we have to focus on finding Hugh," I replied. Seconds later, we heard what sounded like a high-pitched childish giggle coming from upstairs. We rushed to the kitchen, where the sound had come from. But who we found wasn't Hugh, but rather a certain pair of familiar beings. They hadn't changed a bit since the last time I saw them, which made me question whether they were here because they also exited in 2001 or because they were the same ones that I had found in my age who had also followed me back in time. The latter didn't sound that far-fetched considering they were the reason I had been transported to the past in the first place. Molly was as speechless and paralyzed by fear as I had been when I had first encountered them. Thankfully, I was there to grab her hand and encourage her to run away as soon as I noticed they were starting to move towards us. We fled downstairs and hid inside a playroom, locking the door behind us. What the hell are those things? What the fuck is going on?" Molly yelled, sobbing as tears poured down her face. "I'm not entirely sure, but when I told you earlier that my first day hadn't gone as planned, this is what I was referring to. I didn't tell you about it because there's no way you would have believed me without having seen them," I replied. We then heard what sounded like the desperate cries of a small child coming from right outside the playroom. "It's Hugh. What are they doing to him? We need to help him," Molly exclaimed as she grew more and more desperate. "Hold on, Molly, calm down. What if it's a trick they're using to lure us out?" I warned her, but she didn't listen and approached the door. "We need to get out of here. I can't take this anymore," she yelled as she opened the door, only to find one of the entities on the other side, the smaller one, who made a beeline towards her as Molly jumped back and began backing away screaming in panic while the creature crawled towards her. I didn't hesitate to grab a small wooden chair present in that playroom and used it to hit the creature with all my strength. The entity flinched and we used that opportunity to escape the playroom. The other entity, the bigger one, materialized right behind us. We decided to split up and hide in different places in an attempt to disorient it, although in retrospect I admit it wasn't a really smart decision considering sticking together was literally what had just saved Molly from getting caught. But can you really blame us? We were in the middle of an extremely tense situation, and in cases like these most people tend to prioritize instinctive, split-second decisions over reason, even if they later realize that decision wasn't the best in the long run. Molly opted for the bathroom as her hiding spot, while I was still roaming the building searching for mine. I ultimately decided to hide in a chamber on the other side of a door that had a sign which read private. It turned out to be the daycare's boiling room. "Are the monsters gone?" uttered a high-pitched voice that startled me before I realized it came from none other than Hugh, who was also in the room. "Hugh. Thank goodness you're all right. What are you doing in this room?" I said in relief. "They put me in here and then they waited for everyone to leave the daycare, But then they heard there was still someone else inside and they went after them. The kid explained. Molly screamed in the distance. The entities had gone after her. This was already the second time they had focused specifically on Molly, which was odd, since I was the one who had encountered them the previous day. In fact, when I first met them they were so hell-bent on catching me they even seemed to shout my name as they hunted me down. So what was that new obsession with Molly all about? I insisted Hugh to stay behind as I rushed to Molly's aid. The two entities were about to enter the bathroom where Molly was hiding. "I really need to go," Hugh yelled as he ran towards the bathroom despite the fact I had told him to stay in the boiler room, even though it was kind of my fault for foolishly expecting an agitated toddler stuck in a dangerous situation who I had just met to obey me. "No," I shouted as I sprinted towards him. As soon as they saw the child, both of the entities left Molly alone and teleported right next to Hugh, surrounding him before I could reach him. Molly and I reunited as the bigger entity advanced towards us while the small one dealt with Hugh. We were completely cut off from the child. We'd need to somehow bypass the two entities to get to him and there was no way we could do that. The bigger creature chased us relentlessly, leaving us no time to breathe. All we could do was run and the only path we could take was running straight towards the exit. This meant we had to leave Hugh behind, but as much as we hated the idea, we had no other choice. The main door was locked, so we began kicking it and pressing against it with all our energy. We managed to force it open as the distance between us and the creature was only a few feet. We rushed outside the building screaming and took a few minutes to catch our breath outside in the snow. "We need to go home. We can call the police and let them deal with this," Molly exclaimed. "And what are we gonna tell them? If we tell them about the creatures, at best they'll think we're trying to prank them and at worst we'll end up in an insane asylum," I protested. "Yeah, you're right. Still, what are those things going to do to that poor kid? Oh God, what if they kill him?" Molly said. "They won't kill him. I don't know what they want, but I'm pretty sure it's not to kill him, or to kill us. If that was the case, they could have easily killed me when I first found them yesterday, but they only left me unconscious after catching me. And then," I explained, before choosing not to finish my sentence, as doing so would mean confessing to Molly I was a time traveler from the future. "Then what?" she urged me to continue. "Then I woke up inside the daycare and they were just gone," I replied. "Anyhow, I feel sorry for Hugh, but standing here in the cold isn't going to help anyone. I'm freezing. I think we need to return home and rest," Molly suggested. I can't. I'm not from around here. My mother gave me some money and I used it to stay in a nearby bed and breakfast last night. But I don't have enough money to do that again," I confessed. "It's all right. You can come to my place, if you want. I'm sure my parents won't mind," Molly replied. "Thanks, Molly." And so, I left the daycare behind once again, having made a new friend along the way. But if you think my horrific odyssey ended there, you can think again. I worked at a daycare that's been abandoned since 2001. Part 3, Finale. "Molly, hey, Molly, are you awake?" I whispered from the mattress I had slept in at Molly's house. I am now. What's the matter?" Molly drowsily replied as she yawned and rubbed her eyes. "We have to go. We have to return to the daycare," I said. "Are you bonkers? Yesterday was the most traumatic day of my life and I don't want to repeat that again. Besides, we didn't stand a chance against those things yesterday and I'm pretty sure that's not gonna change today," Molly complained. "I know, but we have to. Hugh's still in there, remember? Plus, I need that place, it's the only way I can go back," I uttered before realizing I had accidentally brought up my little secret again. "Go back to where? Come on, Cindy. You're being eerily cryptic again. It makes me feel you have something to hide, and that worries me, especially after what happened at the daycare. No offense, but this is the third time you've creeped me out like this, and I literally met you yesterday," Molly exclaimed, demanding an explanation. I took a deep breath before finally confessing. "All right, Molly, I'm a time traveler. It seems like we're both the same age and in a way that's true, but it also kind of isn't because we're in 2001 but I won't be born until 2004. I come from 20 years into the future. I was hired to work at the daycare, but when I went there in my time I found it to be abandoned. I then encountered the two creatures and I tried to hide but they caught me. After that, I passed out and when I woke up I was suddenly in 2001. That's why I need to return to the daycare, because it's the place where I was sent back in time and the only place I'm aware of where I'll hopefully be able to return to my present," I explained, feeling great relief once I got everything out. A few seconds of silence followed, during which Molly processed everything I had said. "Whoa, that was a lot to take in," she uttered in awe. "I know, it's fine if you don't want to believe me," I assured. "No, I do believe you. It's easy to do once you've literally been haunted by phantoms. It's just that out of all the things I was expecting, this definitely was not it. I was expecting something along the lines of you having a special connection with those entities because they've been haunting your family for generations, or because they're the spirits of deceased relatives, or because you're secretly one of them too, or something like that," Molly admitted. "Do you understand why I have to go back? You don't have to come if you don't want to, but I need to do it. It's not just to go back home either, I also want to know who or what those things are," I said. "But why go now? It's still 6 a.m., there's still 2 hours left until the daycare opens. Plus, I bet the weather outside is absolutely freezing this early in the morning," Molly asked. "That's precisely why I need to go there now. I don't want the place filled with children if things get bad," I clarified. And so, I suited up and prepared to leave. Just as I was about to exit Molly's house, I heard her putting on her winter gear behind me. "Wait, you're coming too?" I asked, given the fact she had openly spoken against going to the daycare just a few minutes earlier. "Yep. I'd hate it to have left you alone if something bad happened to you. Plus, I've just found out you're from the future. You'd have to be crazy to give up the opportunity to spend time with a time traveler," Molly exclaimed. As we marched to the daycare, Molly kept bombarding me with silly questions about the future concerning her wacky and unrealistic expectations, which inevitably made me laugh. At least they distracted me from the chilly weather and also from the fact we were going to the daycare without a plan. We hadn't even thought to carry a weapon. The previous evening, when we were still at Molly's house, we decided to search for ways to beat the creatures from the daycare on the internet, the one from 2001 that is, using Molly's bulky computer, which was the latest model for her and a fascinating archaic relic for me. All we managed to find were several cheesy internet forums discussing paranormal entities with ridiculous methods of dealing with them, which the people who wrote them probably made up on the spot. One of them stood out as it claimed a tormented soul needs to perform a ritual where another soul must inherit their torment in order for them to be freed. We stood before the daycare once more. Getting inside was surprisingly easy, as the front door had stayed open after we had broken out and left it that way the previous day. The building seemed to be empty and quiet, too quiet for comfort. It almost gave me the same vibes as its derelict counterpart from my time, equally as deserted and foreboding, excluding the drastic difference in the building's state of repair. That ambience might initially seem to be justified by the fact 2 hours still remained until the daycare opened. It was theoretically supposed to be empty like this, except we knew for a fact it wasn't really empty. The creatures were still in there, Hugh was still in there. This was surely just a facade to lure us into a false sense of security. It had to be. Maybe they've just left, Molly uttered as we scoured one empty room after another. "Hold on, there's still one room we haven't checked yet," I replied, recalling the room where I had found Hugh the previous day, the boiler room. And so, Molly and I crossed the door with that familiar private sign on it and descended the staircase that led to the boiler room. "Look, in that corner. It's him," Molly pointed out as we found Hugh, who appeared to be unconscious. It wasn't until we got closer to the child that we managed to get a good look of his surroundings. He was laying on a circle surrounded by candles located right next to a second circle surrounded by candles which did not yet contain anyone inside. Had the mysterious entities been responsible for this? It sounded like the most likely conclusion to come to, but why? Were they planning to carry out some sort of twisted ritual involving this innocent preschooler? What happened?" Hugh faintly uttered as he opened his eyes. "You were unconscious inside this circle, Hugh. Did the two creatures did this to you? Do you know where they could be?" I asked him. But before he could utter a reply, he fixedly stared in horror at something Molly and I couldn't see at first because it was right behind us. Something, or rather, someone. The two entities had finally revealed themselves. They approached us in the same agonizing way that had become their trademark by that point. They could have caught us right there, but what they did instead was something that once again made me question their nature. They looked back to the staircase that led outside the boiler room, but nothing was there. A couple seconds later, the daycare's front door could be heard being open, followed by the sound of footsteps and murmurs. Someone else had entered the building, and the two entities knew that before it actually happened. When they had looked back just seconds before, they were anticipating themselves to what was about to happen. Molly and I quickly took advantage of that moment of distraction, snatched Hugh and ran out of the boiler room. We were expecting the two creatures to react quickly and give us chase, But they defied my expectations yet again, as they stood still watching us without moving a muscle. You might be inclined to think they didn't move because they were shocked by our sudden escape and didn't have time to react, but I didn't believe that to be the motive behind their behavior. It looked as if they weren't moving not because of being surprised, but due to the opposite, as if they didn't bother with pursuing us because they had other plans for us later. We rushed to the front door in hopes of leaving that accursed place once and for all, but we were stopped dead in our tracks by the two people we had heard earlier, one of whom was very familiar. You. I knew you'd be here. I knew you'd have something to do with Hugh's disappearance. Last evening I got in contact with the daycare's higher-ups and the police, and they confirmed that the only one who was supposed to be hired to work here was Molly. Look, I don't know who you are, where do you come from, or what do you intend to accomplish, but what you've done is against the law and you need to atone for it. And I see Molly is with you, so I'm sorry, but she's also complicit and will also be fired. Rebecca angrily exclaimed as the policeman that accompanied her stood by her side attempting to intimidate us with his rigid posture and serious stare. But Ms. Rebecca, they're not the bad guys, the two monsters are the bad guys. The two monsters that live here are the ones who kidnapped me. Cindy and Molly have come to save me. Hugh explained after Rebecca gestured him with her hands indicating him to come to her side, but he stubbornly refused and kept firmly gripping my hand. Before anyone could formulate an answer to Hugh's words, they both materialized in front of everyone. The two entities were back from the boiler room. What the hell? Rebecca nervously yelled in panic as her face went pale. All of you, stand back. The policeman ordered us, took a step forward, pulled out a pistol and shot at the creature several times, using his entire magazine. The entities visibly flinched, but didn't really look to be significantly hurt by the bullets. Before he could reload the next magazine, the creatures jumped at him, grabbing his arms and legs the same way they grabbed me when I first encountered them. The policeman screamed in pain for a brief moment until the creatures let go of him and he lay on the floor immobile and speechless. I didn't manage to check if he was unconscious or dead because Molly, Hugh and I were already sprinting towards the exit. Rebecca, come on. We have to get out of here, I exclaimed, encouraging Rebecca to follow us. She seemed to ignore me as she stood still hyperventilating. It was clear she was too shocked to do anything and froze in terror. The entities took that chance and got a hold of her. Cindy. She finally shrieked as the creatures dragged her to a playroom. I did not hesitate to run to her aid. Cindy, wait. Molly tried to stop me. I cannot leave her like this, Molly. You and Hugh can go home, but I need to stay. I replied. No way, I'm abandoning you here. I'm with you too. Molly assured. I'm not leaving either. Hugh added. The three of us rushed to the playroom where Rebecca was being held. She was unconscious while the two creatures stared at us from the playroom's door as we approached them. Listen, she doesn't have anything to do with this. It's me who you want, isn't it? You sent me back in time after I first met you and now you've followed me and are doing all of this to get me, correct? I said to the creatures, awaiting a response which I did not receive. Come on, answer me. You can take me if that's what you want if you leave everyone else alone. I added, but still, the creatures remained silent. Say something. I'm giving myself away. All I ask in return is an answer, I yelled again, growing more and more desperate. It took them a little while, but the creatures finally decided to react. Sin, die, they both uttered in their distorted voices as they pointed at me and stepped aside from the playroom's door, inviting me to come inside. Molly put a hand on my shoulder and shook her head. It's okay, I murmured at her as I stepped inside the playroom. The door abruptly slammed shut once I had entered the playroom, leaving me and Rebecca inside and Molly, Hugh and the two entities outside. I yelled and tried to force the door open, but it was useless. Rebecca and I were trapped. I shook her unconscious body in an attempt to wake her up. Ugh, a headache, I've got a headache, she uttered as she slowly regained consciousness. Rebecca. We're both trapped in here. The two creatures from earlier are outside this room with Molly and Hugh. I nervously explained. Cindy? What? We're trapped? She asked in confusion. Yeah. We have to do something. I replied. I've got the keys in my pocket. They open every door in this daycare, she said as she walked towards the door, pulled out her keys and opened it with ease. Great. Now we have to find Molly and Hugh, I said as we exited the playroom. But those things, they're still in here, aren't they? We have to leave. We have to leave now. Rebecca worryingly replied as her face went pale and she started hyperventilating again. We can leave after we get Molly and Hugh. Didn't you come here because Hugh was missing? I exclaimed. It's no use. This place is haunted, We're all cursed now. I need to go home. Yes, I need a long shower. I need to go home, she yelled in panic before she sprinted towards the exit and left the building screaming. I descended the staircase and went to the boiler room again. I knew they'd be there. Hugh and Molly were laying on the floor inside the 2 circles the creatures had prepared for them while the entities grabbed them both by their arms and legs, the bigger one grabbing Molly and the smaller one grabbing Hugh. Of course, I had been so foolish to think it was all about me. I was never their main target. They always aimed to get Molly and Hugh from the start. I was nothing but the pawn they needed to gather all the other pieces together in the right place at the right time. The 2 creatures dissolved into thin air as Molly and Hugh started twitching. Their bodies began to morph and distort in ways I didn't think were possible. Their hair started to fall off as their skin became something akin to melting wax. I rushed towards them and tightly grabbed Molly's hand. Cindy, Cindy, Sin, die, Sin, die, Molly shouted repeatedly as her voice started to distort and became increasingly harder to understand. Her hand turned pale as an intense wave of pain went through my body. I lost consciousness a split second later. When I woke up, I found myself all alone. The creatures, Molly, Hugh, everyone was gone. As I roamed the daycare, I noticed it looked just as rundown and abandoned as when I first stepped foot inside the place. No trace remained of the vibrant and lively daycare of 2001, the cobwebs, the moldy walls, the broken toys and decaying kiddie attractions, they were all back. I jumped back as I felt my smartphone vibrating inside my pocket. It had been inactive ever since I was sent back to 2001, but it seemed it was working again. Hi, Cindy. I've just finished my shift and I'm on my way to pick you up at the daycare. How was your first day, dear? My mother said through the phone as I broke into tears.